Good afternoon, folks. My name's Tom Peebles, and today is August 18th, 2011, and I'm in Nashville, Tennessee to interview Judge Tom Higgins. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Good afternoon, Judge Higgins.
Good afternoon, Mr. Peebles.
Judge, I know from experience that when you were practicing law, you always signed your papers Thomas A. Higgins, and you signed them. Once you got on the bench, you signed them same way, Thomas A. Higgins. And what's your full name?
Well, before we go any further, is this being taken under the pains and penalties of perjury?
Yes.
My full name is Thomas Aquinas Higgins.
All right. And let me go back a little further before you were born. Tell us about your grandparents, their names and where they lived and what they did.
Well, my paternal grandfather lived in County Galway, the west of Ireland. And my maternal grandfather lived in Amboy, Illinois.
All right. Now, and what did he do? She do?
He worked on the railroad, the Illinois Central. He came to this country, my maternal grandfather, during the potato famine in the 1840s. And they settled in Illinois and homesteaded, and he worked on the railroad, the building of the Illinois Central Railroad, and he also, they acquired several big farms, and that's where the McGee family was reared in Illinois.
All right, now let's get down to you in particular.
Well,
when and where were you born?
I was born on August 15, 1932, here in Nashville. I was 79 years old this past Monday.
All right. I did one thing I didn't ask you, I should have. How did your parents meet, do you know?
Well, my father was born near a village called Kilconley in County Galway, the west of Ireland. He was born in 1892 and grew up in County Galway, the west of Ireland. And he came to this country about 1912, and he came directly to Nashville. His uncle, my grandmother Higgins's brother, had come to this country about 1880 and had formed a business, a dry goods business on the public square here in Nashville. And my father came to this country to work for his uncle in the dry goods business on the public square across from the Davison County Courthouse. It was called H.J. Grimes and Company. My father had an older brother whose name was Thomas, who had come to this country even earlier, around the turn of the century, and he died at an early age, and Uncle Harry wrote my grandmother and said, "Send me another boy," and that's how my father came to this country. Ireland at that time was a good place to be from, although when my father came to this country, he was very homesick. In fact, he went back to Ireland with the view of teaching school and bought some property, but he had tasted the United States of America, and so he came back and he stayed. And he was a bachelor for about 10 years after he came to this country and married my mother. She was Margaret McGee, Her father was a railroad engineer on the Tennessee Central Railroad, and they met here in Nashville and were married in 1923.
Now, you already told us you're from Davidson County. Could you narrow that down a bit? Where?
Well, my father bought a house while it was being built, even before he married. It was on Barton Avenue, and that's between Fairfax and Essex Place and Blair Boulevard. At that time, it was in the county. It wasn't even in the city of Nashville. And I'm told that Barton Avenue was a gravel road. It extended from 24th Avenue to Natchez Trace, and our home was on the very top of the hill. And I grew up there along with my older brother and two sisters. I'm the youngest of four children.
Right. You had one brother, is that correct?
Yes.
What did he do, Judge?
My older brother, John Joseph Higgins, known as Jack, after the war, went to the seminary and studied for the priesthood. And in 1952, he was ordained as a Marinol missioner and was assigned to the missions in Bolivia. My sister, older sister, Catherine Bridget, known as Kitty, she was married in 1948, about 3 days after both she and her husband, Morris Hamilton Brogdon, he also grew up in Nashville and was a World War II veteran. And when he came home, went back to school. And when they finished college in 1948, I think it was about 3 days after they finished college, they were married. And he died recently after 61 years of marriage and they had 5 children and a number of grandchildren. My next older sister, Margaret Mary Higgins, also known as Bitsy, she too married a World War II veteran. When he came home after the war, went back to school, and they were married and had 5 children and now multiple grandchildren. And he died recently. In fact, both of my brother-in-laws died in the same year, 2009, and Bitsy and Walton Cunningham Thompson were married 59 years.
Tell us one thing I'm not sure I understood. Your brother was he a Catholic priest?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Well, let me just close the circle. He was on the mission in Bolivia, working at 12 to 14,000 feet up in the Andes. He went there in 1952, and every 6 years they got 6 months off, and he came home in 1958 for a 6 month sabbatical. And I was in the Army at that time. We'll come to that. And then he went back to Bolivia, and he came home again 6 years later in 1964, just as my father was in his last illness before his death. And then he went back to Bolivia, and in 1967 he was stricken with cancer and came home, and he was attempting to get to the National Institute of Health in Washington when he called me and said, you better come up here. And he was diagnosed with cancer, and we arranged to get an air ambulance and bring him to Nashville. He's admitted to St. Thomas Hospital and lived about 25 days. And he died in August 1967.
Right. Judge, one thing I'd like to know, what was it like back in those days to grow up Catholic in a very Protestant city? Any discrimination involved?
Not that I was aware of. I participated in the usual sort of games and neighborhood activities. Dr. Region and Mrs. Region lived one street over, almost back to our house, and I grew up with the Region boys, Gene Region Jr., who followed his father as a very distinguished orthopedic surgeon, David Region, who was later on the faculty at Vanderbilt Medical School, and the youngest, Barney Region, who's a lawyer in Dixon, Tennessee, and a host of other friends. I was a member of Troop 13, Boy Scout Troop. We had a cabin up on Gazard Hill between Hillside and Overlook, and I became an Eagle Scout, participated in all the scouting activities, learned to swim in the Harpeth River down at Old Camp Boxville and on the Harpeth River. And today, now that I'm more or less retired, I'm renewing acquaintances with boys I grew up with, or men, and we meet regularly for lunch or at the coffee shop. And I wasn't aware of any kind of, and as far as I can recall, any kind of awareness of hostility as a result of being a Catholic. I went to Catholic schools, and the other boys in the neighborhood all went to, started at Aiken Elementary down on Fairfax, one street over, Calvert Junior High School, and to West End High School. And so I would say that I had a perfectly normal childhood.
Well, tell us, and I'm really still in your childhood now, what were your hobbies? What did you do? I mean,
well, scouting played a large part in my life at that time, but I can recall the neighborhood games. We would play capture the flag and roam for blocks and blocks. In the wintertime, when it snowed, of course, we lived on the top of a steep hill, and we would sled down to the foot of Barton Avenue into 24th Avenue. And the Swiggerts lived on 24th Avenue. Judge Will Swigert, the father of Judge Jimmy Swigert, who you would have known on the Sixth Circuit Court of Davidson County. And I can recall when Watauga Lake over at Centennial Park would freeze, we would go over there, and my sister would attempt to ice skate, but that frozen lake at Centennial was pretty rough to skate on. But the Park Service would haul big logs in there, and we'd have a big fire on the side of the lake at Centennial Park. And we also would have a fire at the top of the hill on Barton Avenue. We'd build it right in the gutter, and in front of the Witt's house. There were 3 Witt boys, and that's where we would take off to go sledding down Barton Avenue. And one of my oldest friends, Henry Gordon Wynn, who remains a close friend of mine. He grew up next door from the time we were 5 years old, and we even roomed together in college at one point for a short time. And we went to Europe together in 1955 at the end of my first year in law school. And I could call off a host of other names. One that comes to mind is Bob Dudley Smith, who later achieved some fame as a basketball player at West End High School. And there was just a host of kids in the neighborhood that we grew up with, and many of whom I still see now, and they're all in their late 70s or early 80s, worn out old men like I am.
You mentioned that you went to Catholic schools. Where did you start your schooling? I mean in the beginning.
Well, in the first grade, I started at Aiken, the public school down on Fairfax. At that point in the first grade, they had a morning session for first graders and an afternoon session. And for some reason, my mother enrolled me in Aiken. But from the second grade on, I was in the parochial schools. I went to the Cathedral Grade School on West End Avenue, the Cathedral of the Incarnation. It had a grade school, and I was there through the 8th grade. And then I went to Father Ryan High School, which at that time was on Elliston Place. It was an all-boys school, about 400 students in the student body, and priests. The faculty was composed of all Catholic priests. There were 2 nuns. One taught mathematics, trig, geometry, algebra, and the other was the librarian. And they were really very able teachers, women, as were the priests. And so I was at Father Ryan for the 4 years, and I had the usual high school, prep school curriculum. I took 4 years of Latin, 2 years of Spanish, 4 years of English, algebra, geometry, trig, the sciences, and finished Father Ryan. I started Father Ryan in September 1946 and was graduated in May or June 1950.
And did all that experience come in handy later in your life?
Well, yes. I developed a love of history, and the librarian would give, I guess, to keep me from misbehaving, would see that I had a steady supply of books. There was a large study hall on the top floor, and the library was at one end and the chapel at the other. And the librarian, Sister Mary Nolasco, kept me busy with books that she would steer to me. And I also enjoyed, and that began a real interest in history. And then I enjoyed the English courses. Particularly, I had a splendid teacher in the junior or senior year, and he was Father Rowling at the time, later Monsignor Rowling, the pastor of St. Henry's Church for a long time, long after these high school days, and he could make Shakespeare come alive. And we were required to commit to memory poetry. And I still recall the opening lines of the Rubaiyat, awake morning in the bowl of night, And lo, the hunter of the east is come, and flung the stone that put the stars to flight. And it goes on and on and on. But I can still remember and recite some of the poetry I was required to learn in high school. And I remember reading, and it was tedious because we had to use the pony in the back of the Latin textbook to assist in the translation, but I recall reading the Caesar's history of the Gallic Wars, and then in the third and fourth year we read the Punic Wars, and I can come back to that at a later time when we talk about some of the lawsuits about what I recall from Latin, high school Latin, reading the Punic Wars about and I'll tell you about that at a later point, about when Rome conquered Carthage, they imposed what we even know today as a Carthaginian peace. But I'll save that tidbit for later in connection with what I consider a famous lawsuit here in the Middle District of Tennessee.
Okay, well, did all that Latin that you took early on, did that come in handy later on?
It did, I suppose, in a way that I can't really quantify at this point. Of course, in law school, I went to law school in the days when the forms of action were required in civil procedure. I don't suppose law students today even come out of law school knowing anything about trespass on the case or assumption or waiving the tort and suing assumption. But some of the Latin phrases in law have a certain resonance from that study in high school.
Well, you can give me an example of that?
Sine qua non.
What
You
about,
understand that, Mr. Peebles?
I think so. How about res ipsa loquitur?
Well, I never really understood it. I knew what it meant.
All right.
And I think I got hit by it for a couple of times in lawsuits. I tried to sidestep res ipsa.
All right. Let's move on to your higher education now. I've got you out of grade school and all that. Where did you go? Where did you go to school?
Well, when I finished high school, I went to Memphis to Christian Brothers College. My father had studied under the Christian Brothers in Ireland, and he thought at that time Christian Brothers was a 2-year junior college. It's now a 4-year college, or it's Christian Brothers University. In fact, I've served on the board of trust of Christian Brothers University in Memphis. And it was all boys at that time, and the brothers had the origins in France, and also a branch of the Christian Brothers were in Ireland, where my father went to school to the Christian Brothers. And it was in a sense, an intellectual awakening for me. I enjoyed those years, those 2 years at Christian Brothers. I had some professors who were extraordinarily able men, and I studied Thomistic philosophy, the works of the great St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, and Aristotelian logic, as well as the other courses of history and English and mathematics. And the one thing I got out of the Christian Brothers at that time was really developing good study habits. We were required to be in the dormitory, and there was a study hours at 7 or 7:30 until 10 o'clock, and a brother lived on the hall in the dormitory. And on Friday nights, we could stay out to perhaps 11 o'clock or something, but we had to be back in the dormitory. And on Saturday night, perhaps as late as midnight. It was an entirely different world from college experience at this day and time. But it stood me in good stead. I learned to study, and those study habits stood me in good stead in the last 2 years of college and through law school. It was a form of discipline that served me well in my further educational experience.
Okay, most of the schooling you've told us about at this point was single sex.
Yes.
Do you recommend that?
Yes, I do, as far as secondary education. My oldest son, we sent him to MBA, Montgomery Bell Academy, an all-boys school. And my second son was at Battleground Academy, and then later moved to Father Ryan High School when it was still an all-boys school, before it moved from Elliston Place out here on Franklin Road in Oak Hill. And our oldest child, Catherine, was at Overbrook grade school on Harding Road. That was run by the Dominican sisters, where she was there from kindergarten through the 8th grade, and then went on to St. Cecilia Academy on the same campus. And by the time she finished St. Cecilia, she made it clear to her mother and to me that she was through with all-girl schools and was ready for a different experience. And at that point, Rob Purdy, the senior vice chancellor at Vanderbilt, was our next door neighbor. And he knew a lot about young people and college-age kids and going into college. And she wanted to go away to school, and Chancellor Purdy recommended Ole Miss. And Catherine thrived in that environment at Ole Miss after being in a girls' school from kindergarten through high school. And I can remember writing her when she was at Ole Miss, advising her not to let her social life interfere with her academic studies. And I don't think she ever committed that error or omission. But that's sort of the history of our children's education. Thomas went to Auburn, and he's a mechanical engineer at this time. And John was at Christian Brothers, and he and his brother-in-law, Pete DeLay, are in the concrete pipe business. John is what he calls himself a sewer pipe salesman, Sherman-Dixie Concrete Pipe Company. But we're very proud of these three children.
You're speaking now of your children.
My children.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, but that's a long-winded response to your inquiry about single-sex education. I think there's a real place for it on the secondary level at that point of separating boys and girls. I really am convinced that they do better separated than than on a co-ed basis at that age. Now that's my view of it.
If, for example, you're in an all-men's school, there's not much distraction from the young ladies, is there?
Well, you would know about that as a student at the University of the South at Swanee. You were there before there were any girls on the campus, except if they were imported on social occasions. And so you could testify better as to what occurred up there on the mountain at Swanee.
We'll just leave that subject if you don't mind. Tell me, what degree did you earn
at Christian Brothers?
Christian Brothers.
After 2 years, I got an associate in arts. And then I matriculated to the University of Tennessee at the other end of the state. And there I majored in history and minored in philosophy. And I finished University of Tennessee in May 1954.
Right. Well, now, you were living in Nashville when you went to, your home was in Nashville, but you went to Knoxville to the University of Tennessee, is that correct?
Yes.
What prompted you to do that?
I wanted to I'd had 2 years in Memphis at Christian Brothers, and I wanted to have the experience of again, living away from home, but I wanted to go to where there was a larger student body, and girls. But I studied all the time when I was in Knoxville. I didn't engage in any of the frivolities those that you partook in at Swanee. I was all business, Mr. Peebles, all business.
Well, this is about you, not me, Judge. So let me ask you another question or two here and get away from Swanee.
I got to get my licks in from time to time.
I figured you would. By the way, if you know some of these questions I'm asking you, if you've got any objections to them, let me just overrule them right now. All right?
No, I'll sustain my own objections.
Well, you can, of course.
And I'll tell you an incident.
You can take the fifth if you're mind to. I mean,
pardon?
You can take the fifth if you're mind to. I can't do you out of your constitutional right.
I think I've been granted immunity by Miss Bernstein, the executive director of this foundation. I want to give a plug to her. She's over here writing notes to you, prompting you so you won't stumble and bumble around in this interrogation.
Okay, what degree did you tell me you got at UT?
A Bachelor of Arts.
Okay. And now, where do we go from there?
Well,
education-wise.
The next step was I came back to Nashville, and I went to Vanderbilt Law School. And Vanderbilt Law School at that time was on the second and third floor of Kirkland Towers, the big building with the great big clock tower on it. And it was not a large student body. There wasn't anything required in the way of sitting for a board examination of a LSAT, I think they call it. I recall going up to the dean's office and say, I want to come to law school, and perhaps I'd made an application if that was required while I was still in college in Knoxville, and had a transcript sent there. And as I recall, the tuition, it was on a semester basis. I think the tuition was $400 or $500 a semester. And so I entered Vanderbilt Law School in the fall of 1954. And I met men on that occasion who remained and remain till this day friends more than 50 years ago. Well, 57 years ago from the time I started law school. On that first day, I can remember meeting George Barrett, John Hollins, Tom Shriver, Jim Neal, Jim Gilliland from Memphis, Bill Henry from Memphis, Roy Keithley from Memphis. And these are men who have remained friends through all of those years. Since then, of course, Jim Neal passed away a year ago. Tom Shriver passed away several years ago. He was the longtime District Attorney General here in Davison County, and later on the Davison County Criminal Court, and later on the Court of Criminal Appeals, I think. George Barrett continues to practice. It was many of these men had been at Vanderbilt undergraduate, and they were taking their senior year in absentia. So they had 3 years of college, and the first year of law school counted as their last year in college. And there were a number of my fellow students who were returning from the Korean War as veterans. Jim Neal had been in the Marine Corps after he finished the University of Wyoming, and then he was relieved from active duty, and he came to law school, as did Dan Self, who's now in Meridian, Mississippi. There were a number of my classmates who were veterans from the Korean War who were coming to law school at that time.
Well, you know, what I'm wondering about is what prompted you to go to law school in the first place? Did you have some lawyers in your family, or did you know some lawyers?
Yes, there are lawyers in my family. My father's oldest brother, my great uncle, John Franklin McGee, had read law in a lawyer's office in Illinois, and then removed to what was known as the Dakota Territories, and later moved again back to Minnesota. And in the Harding administration, he was appointed to the United States District Court for the District of Minnesota. And then my father's youngest brother, both the older brother, Judge McGee, and my grandfather, put their younger brother through Notre Dame undergraduate and Notre Dame Law School, and he finished law school at Notre Dame in 1901, and he went to North Dakota to practice law, and his grandsons are practicing in Minot, North Dakota till today. And then my family had good friends, one of whom was Judge Frank Wade, who lived almost directly across from us on Barton Avenue. And he and Mr. Cornelius and Judge Swigert were law partners at one point. And when the first Judge Wade, Frank Wade, became the first General Sessions judge in Davison County, when that private act was passed that created the General Sessions Court and took the jurisdiction away from the old-fashioned Justice of the Peace courts. And I was in and out of Judge Wade's house across the street, and I was always struck, and I guess my fancy was excited by his library and those shelves lined with books. And later Judge Wade gave me a substantial portion of his law library. and I in turn have made gifts of some of the old treatises that came to me from Judge Wade. And then Judge Frank Langford, a longtime circuit judge here in Davison County, was a friend of my mother and father's. And Judge Richard P. Dews was also a friend. He was another circuit judge here in Davison County. And I came to know Judge Dews, who lived out on Brush Hill Road on the Cumberland River, and came to know him real well. And I recall that I was named to the committee to draft his memorial resolution that was chaired by Jack Norman Sr. Somehow, I guess Mrs. Dews may have alerted Jack Norman to get me named to that committee. And I knew Judge Langford, and he was a holy terror, long-time circuit judge in this county. So I had an acquaintance with lawyers, and I suppose it was somewhere along the line that excited my interest. Although my mother wanted me to go to West Point. Most of her McGee cousins were West Point graduates and had distinguished military careers. General John Hugh McGee was a 1933 West Point graduate and was to avoid capture in the Philippines, where he was assigned at the time the war started. He fled to the jungle and helped a number of prisoners to escape via submarines that would come in and pick up escaped prisoners of war. And then there was another cousin. He wound up as a brigadier general. And another cousin, George McGee, retired after a distinguished career as a full colonel. Interestingly, they never went back to North Dakota. When they retired in San Antonio to Fort Sam Houston. Any career I might have had as a West Point student fell to the ground, so to speak, in my junior year in high school when my eyes failed and I couldn't have passed the physical examination, although later when I sought a commission after law school, the requirements apparently were not as stringent as they were for entry into West Point at that time. And I might add that Percy Priest, the longtime congressman from this district, lived on Fairfax, just the next street over. And my father and Congressman Priest were good friends as well as neighbors. And so I might have had a chance for an appointment, but in any event, all is well that ends well.
Let's go back for a minute. You told us about some of your classmates in Vanderbilt Law School. You had some pretty fine professors there too, I think. Can you tell us about them?
Well, John Wade was the dean of the law school and taught torts, and was a very fine man and a splendid teacher. And then Edmund M. Morgan, fondly known as Eddie Morgan, taught civil procedure and evidence, and he was greatly either loved or feared. And in civil procedure, we studied the forms of action, the common law forms of action. And Morgan, came to Vanderbilt after he retired at Harvard, and was a highly renowned professor of law. Then there was Paul Hartman, known as the Dutchman, who taught contracts in state and local taxation, I think, and Herman Troutman, who taught wills and trust, and I think income tax. And then I recall Bill Harbison, who was in the same firm that you went to later. He was a lecturer in law. Of course, as we know, he was later on the Supreme Court of Tennessee and was Chief Justice. Bill Harbison, as I recall, taught real and personal property, I think. And we had Austin Wakeman Scott, Jr., whose father was the great Scott on Trust. Scott was an interesting fellow. Can recall that each class would begin with, in that Boston accent, with a statement such as, "Last time, gentlemen, we were studying what Father had to say about the springing use." And I don't know if any lawyer has ever dealt with a springing use, but whatever a springing use was, Austin Wakeman Scott, Jr. Attempted to teach us about it. And so and Merton Ferson, professor of contracts, was a interesting fellow. He always wore, he'd change out of his suit jacket into what we might consider sort of a laboratory coat. He didn't want to get his cuffs, I guess, muddied up with chalk on the blackboard, and we all were amused because Professor Ferson would pose a question, and he would use Pompey, the cow who was halfway up the greased pole when another creature said, "I revoke," or "I revokes," and "Do we have a contract, gentlemen?" And then Eddie Morgan would always come into class after the bell rang, and he'd have a glass of water. And on one occasion, he came in early and put his glass of water down on the desk, and somebody had the audacity to put perhaps a rose, a stem down in the glass, and Morgan came in and saw that, and he said, "Some damn fool in this class doesn't know the difference between a vase and a glass of water." But at that time, we all wore coats and ties to class, and we stood to recite. There wasn't any of this business of slouching in your seat. You stood up and learned to take the fire of musketry on your feet and defend your position. And we were required to take a mandatory course called the legal profession on Saturday at 8 a.m. And it was taught by Mr. Cecil Sims and Mr. Raymond Denny, and they would alternate Saturdays. And you didn't have any choice. You were required to take it, 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. I suppose if the dean of the Vanderbilt Law School now attempted to have a class at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, there'd probably be a rebellion out there. And from time to time, I've been out to the Vanderbilt, been asked to speak to a class or something, and the student bodies look like a collection of homeless people with their backpacks and their frayed jeans, and some of the faculty not any improvement on that with their sneakers. And so it's a different day from today, and no air conditioning. The library was 2 stories. Those big church windows that were arched at the top, we would open those on either side of the library to get a cross breeze, and the stacks were 2 or 3 stories at one end, and early on, Jim Neal, George Barrett, and I began to study together, and we frequently met at my house. I was living at home on Barton Avenue, and Jim Neal's wife at that time was working at the telephone company. George Barrett was single, and we would study, or we would study in some corner over at the law school. And when the library closed at 10 o'clock, we would retreat to, there was a place down there at the Triangle where Broadway turns into 21st Avenue, and it was called Melfi's. It was the first place in Nashville that made pizza. And occasionally we may have gone over there, perhaps on a Friday night, and had a beer and pizza. But we had long study sessions, and through those 3 years in law school, and that was very productive and helpful, and it deepened our friendship. And at some point, John J. Hooker Jr., who I think had been in law school and then had to go to the Army, and when he came back, he was in our class, and I remember we let John J. study with us, and I know we did later for the bar, and I recall that we helped him in bills and notes, and because John J. had a good mind and a retentive memory, and he could recall the rules of relating to an accommodation endorser and that type of thing long enough to repeat it on an examination. And he had developed a technique of sort of a Socratic form of acquiring information, and he had a retentive memory. I don't think he spent a lot of time studying. I sat next to him in class because we sort of sat alphabetically, and I had a tug of war with John J. because in those days we would brief cases and paste them into the notebook, and the carbon paper would fold over. And if John J. was called on, Higgins, Hooker, next seat over, he'd get my book and shift it over in front of him, and I'd have to pull it back. But those were exciting and stimulating days. And then I guess in the second year, I was fortunate to be selected for the Law Review, and we began writing for the Law Review as well as doing what's known as blue booking, checking the citations, and also we would check in blue book the lead articles written by scholars at other schools that were the articles to be published in the Vanderbilt Law Review. So it was intellectually stimulating time.
One more question about your law school days, and maybe we can take a break then. You mentioned a lot of your classmates. You didn't mention any women. Were there any women in your class at Vanderbilt Law School?
There were, I think there were 2 women in the class ahead of me, ahead of us. Doris Dudney is one that I recall. And there was one in our class, Jimmy Lou Foster from Scottsboro, Alabama, who married John Bolt. And I think John Bolt has been in the practice of law all these years in Tampa, Florida. He was Reber Bolt's nephew.
All right, well, maybe we could stand a break about now. Would that suit you, Judge?
That's fine.
Judge, I've been referring to you as Judge out of respect, but you and I have known each other a long time, hadn't we?
A long time.
How long you reckon?
Well, from the time you began to practice law, some point in the 1960s, when you went to Tribune, Sturtevant, and Harbison, and I was at Cornelius, Collins, Higgins, and well, at the point it was Cornelius, Collins, Neal, and Higgins. Jim Neal had come to us, and later Charles Hampton White came to us. So it was Cornelius, Collins, Neal, Higgins, and White. We were on the 23rd floor of the LNC Tower, and Tribune and Sturtevant and Harbison were on the 26th floor, I think.
Yeah, you remember we used to look out the window into your office, and you thought we were trying to read your papers?
Well, that was later after we moved across the street to the new Third National Bank building. We moved from the 23rd floor to the Third National Bank building in 1968 when that new bank building was opened.
All right.
And you all were looking down on us at that point.
I recall that.
And spying on me.
All right, Judge, and again, well, I don't normally call you Judge. I call you Thomas Aquinas. Is that right?
It's perfectly all right, Thomas Henry.
All right, you and I tried cases against each other and with each other, and I think I tried at least one case before you when you went on the bench.
That's correct.
Glad you're willing to admit that. All right, let's get back on the subject here now. You, I think we finished your education at Vanderbilt University Law School.
Well, about that case.
Which case?
The case you tried before me, that was Yale University. You represented Yale versus Fisk University. And I was sitting as the trier of fact without a jury. And I recall it was a case based on diversity jurisdiction. And we got near the end of your proof, you were ready to rest. And I said, now, Mr. Peebles, I haven't heard any proof about the citizenship of Yale University and Fisk University as the predicate for invoking the jurisdiction of this court. And I think that sent you into a midnight scurrying to dredge up the ancient documents about the incorporation of Yale University. But I had you pinned to the wall there for a short period of time.
Well, if you'll remember, the Fisk had admitted diversity, admitted that, and I found a case where you had tried Fisk, a case involving Fisk before, in a diversity case, and I took the position that you judicially knew that Fisk was a Tennessee corporation. You
And
know that?
I think I responded that perhaps, Mr. Peebles, I was mistaken in that earlier case.
All right, that's enough of that case. Let's move on to something else. You were, while I'm at it, you got the only ashtray here. What are you smoking?
That's a very fine cigar. It's called a King Edward Special, and you can buy them at a famous tobacco store called Mapco.
For how much?
That's a state secret.
All right, let's move on here. You were in the military, were you not?
I was, yes.
What branch?
I was in the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the United States Army.
And where did you serve, and what?
I applied for a commission after I finished law school and received a direct commission as a first lieutenant, and I entered service at Fort Lee, Virginia, at Petersburg in September 1957, and then I was sent to the Judge Advocate General's Corps School at the University of Virginia for a 3-month course, and then I was transferred to the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell, at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to the Staff Judge Advocate's office, where I was an assistant staff judge advocate.
Why did you go into the Army in the first place? Were you drafted, or did you volunteer?
Well, I had an obligation because I had received a deferment in college, so I was fulfilling an obligation that I had, and I served 3 years on active duty, almost 2 years at Fort Campbell, and then I was transferred to the office of the Judge Advocate General of the Army in the Pentagon in September 1959 to September 1960, and I was assigned to the office of the Chief of Military Justice.
What were your duties in that regard?
Well, at Fort Campbell, I was assigned as government trial counsel to prosecute general court-martials, and I rotated at some point to defense counsel. When I was there, General Westmoreland was the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell, and he kept 2 general court-martials impaneled all the time. We had a busy trial schedule. Discipline was very strict, and we tried the usual variety of cases involving absence without leave, desertion, and also tried it. I remember trying the case of one officer who was a West Point graduate, as a matter of fact, who would sign the manifest for one of the required jump to stay on jump pay status, but he would duck out after drawing his parachute and signing the manifest, but he continued to draw jump pay. And I remember we tried him for fraud, and he was convicted and sent to the disciplinary barracks and was dismissed from the officers' corps. And then we tried a variety of cases, you know, assaults and batteries that involved scuffles and knifings and that type of thing. Just a variety of cases.
Well, and this when you entered military service, this was, and went with JAG. This was very shortly after you'd finished Vanderbilt Law School, wasn't it?
Yes.
How did you know how to try cases?
Learned by sitting first with another lawyer who was had been in the Army longer than I did, and learned the procedure. The advantage of that experience was that you were granted substantial responsibility early on, and as a young lawyer, trying these cases, first as assisting another lawyer, and then beginning to try the cases by oneself. And the court-martial was usually presided over by a full colonel and other officers, lieutenant colonels and majors and captains, and occasionally senior non-commissioned officers if there was an enlisted non-commissioned officer being tried. And then there was a JAG officer who served as the law officer, later called the military judge, when the code was amended.
All right,
But we had a heavy trial docket.
well, knowing where you served, first at Fort Campbell and then in the Pentagon, I assume you didn't get any Purple Hearts, but did you get any kind of recognition or for your service in the Judge Advocate General's office?
Yes, I received the Army Commendation Medal for my service at Fort Campbell, and later in the Pentagon at the end of my tour, I received a second Army Commendation Medal, which was represented by an oak leaf cluster for the second award, and other certificates of achievement of some sort.
All right.
And that experience in the Pentagon at that point, that was during the Eisenhower administration, and General Eisenhower wanted to reduce the presence, uniform presence in the military district of Columbia. So unless we had some duty that would require us to go up to the Secretariat's office or into the suite that adjoined our suite of the Judge Advocate General of the Army himself, we were permitted to wear civilian clothes. It was like working in a big law firm in a sense. And I had some interesting experiences while I was there, and I'll just touch on it briefly. I served as a junior officer on a committee appointed by the Secretary of the Army, Wilbur Brucker, during the Eisenhower administration. He had been, I think, governor of Michigan and on the Supreme Court of Michigan. And he appointed a committee of general officers to study the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And the staff consisted of Colonel Hal Parker, a lieutenant colonel, who was later Judge Advocate General of the Army, Captain York, who later had a distinguished career as a Judge Advocate officer, and Lieutenant Higgins, and the civilian secretary. So I was the junior man on a three-man staff to this committee of general officers appointed by the Secretary of the Army. The other significant thing that occurred while I was there in the office of the Chief of Military Justice is that we supervised two executions that took place at Fort Leavenworth that arose from the Korean War that just ripened while I was there, and what's called the death warrant, really the action to be signed by the President of the United States, was prepared in our office. And on the night those executions took place, I recall that we had to stay there, and we had an open line to Fort Leavenworth, an open phone line to the pardon attorney in the Justice Department, an open line to the military aide-de-camp to the President in the White House and to the White House counsel's office in the event the President elected to exercise clemency at the last minute. And I recall that I played some hand in drafting the press release because it was released in Washington, although the executions took place in Fort Leavenworth at the disciplinary barracks. And I don't think a death penalty case has reached that level since then. I may be mistaken, but I don't think any president since Eisenhower ever ordered a military death penalty into execution. I could be mistaken in that respect.
How would these men have been executed? In what? Firing squad or chair? Or?
By hanging. And curiously enough, at the same time, a death penalty case ripened in the Navy. And the chief of military justice in the Navy Judge Advocate General's office, and it's Judge Advocate General of the Navy, not Admiral, came over to the Judge Advocate General of the Army, to the Chief of Military Justice in the Judge Advocate General's office of the Army, and they wanted to, they had never carried out a death penalty case for reasons I can explain, and they didn't have the procedures for conducting a military execution, and they wanted to borrow our pamphlet on procedures of how many steps and how to have the necessary noose prepared and so forth. And there was a big to-do up there in our office about whether the Army ought to turn over to the Navy these procedures for carrying out a military execution. And it's about that time I decided I'd need to be somewhere else instead of the Army. But the reason, as I understood it, back in before the Civil War, the minor son of the Secretary of the Navy ran off to sea as a cabin boy or something. And it was alleged that he had participated in a mutiny. And the captain of that Navy frigate conducted a court-martial on board the ship in San Francisco Bay. And this youngster, as well as others who had participated in the attempted mutiny, were hanged. And when that ship came back to the East Coast, I think to New York Naval Yards, the captain of that ship was tried for abuse of his authority and perhaps murder, and I don't know the outcome of that case, but as I recall, I was told that out of that tradition, while there had been death sentences imposed by court-martials in the Navy, and they had reached various levels of review, that at some point they had been knocked out and never had ripened to the point where the president signed the action to order the execution. Now that's my recollection.
Okay, well,
of that tidbit of history.
I just wonder, with that experience you've had, do you have an opinion now about capital punishment?
Yes.
Do you mind telling us what it is?
I think that that it's appropriate if fairly administered and carried out, it's serious business for the state/government to inflict the ultimate penalty. And so all concerned in the matters, such matters, need to be very careful. And so I have no moral objection to it. I think if it's justly imposed, fairly administered, I have no moral qualms about it.
Well,
and I tried as a lawyer a first-degree murder case, and I can tell you, sitting at counsel table, and in those days when I tried that case with Bill Willis, the jury imposed the penalty, and there wasn't any bifurcated sentencing hearing. And when you're sitting there with your client to one side and you hear the court instruct the jury they can find the defendant guilty or not guilty on first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, and impose death by electrocution, that focus your attention on the seriousness of the business.
okay. I said I wasn't going to call you judge anymore, but I can't help it. It's usually Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, you said just a few minutes ago that at some point you'd had enough of the Army.
Well, I found it was a useful experience, and I've profited from it. And when I got ready to leave active duty, the colonel I worked for at the time called me in because I was offered a regular Army commission and the opportunity to get a master's degree in international law and to go to the Army language school at the Presidio in San Francisco. And so I would just be promoted to captain promptly. So I would just be back in school, going to graduate school. And so this colonel called me in, and when I made my mind up not to stay in the Army, and he said, now, when you're proud of the high school you went to, yes sir. You're proud of the college you went to, yes sir. You proud of the law school you went to, yes sir. He said, now when you go home, think of yourself as an alumnus of the United States Army, and be proud of the United States Army. The Army has been good to you. You're a young man, and you've had the opportunity to have a lot of responsibility at an early stage in your legal career, and be proud of your service in the United States Army. And I've always had a kind feeling in that regard for my service in the United States Army. And the men I served with and under, first Colonel Paul J. Durbin at Fort Campbell, and later Thomas Aquinas Ryan in the Pentagon, and Colonel Hal Parker, who was later Judge Advocate General of the Army, and a host of other officers. They were top-notch men and would have been a success in private life just as they were in their military careers. Most of the men, all the men I've just mentioned were World War II veterans and came home and remained in the reserves and were called back to active duty when the Korean War started. And after that point, they had so much time that they might as well stay in the Army. And they were first-rate lawyers and officers, and a credit to the military service and the legal profession.
All right, well,
So I have high praise for him.
I understand it. But at some point in time, you chose to come home back to Nashville, didn't you?
I did. In September 1960, I came back to Nashville.
But you were relieved from active duty?
I was. But I had an obligation for 3 additional years in the inactive reserves, and I joined a reserve unit here in Nashville that was commanded by Colonel Arthur Crownover. That was Crownover, Brandstatter, and Folk. And Arthur Crownover was a fine man. And in that reserve unit was George Cate, Jr., who stayed in, became a brigadier general, I think. Avon Williams, who stayed in the reserves and became a full colonel. Jimmy Linebaugh, who stayed in the reserves. Bill Willis was in the reserves, that unit. And I stayed in the reserve unit. I know I was promoted to captain, but I was busy beginning my law practice. And after those 3 years of required inactive reserve duty, I dropped out.
All right. And of course
perhaps I should have stayed in, and I would have had another pension.
Let's go back. Let's go to the point where you came back to Nashville. And what were your reasons for coming back home, back to Nashville?
I wanted to practice law. I wanted to practice law in Nashville.
I want to make a living.
Yes.
Anything else?
Well, I don't know what you're suggesting.
Well,
At some point, I began to see the lady who I later married. She had been to Trinity College in Washington, D.C. as a college girl while I was assigned to the Pentagon as a bachelor Army officer. And our families were friends. And I recall that my mother at some point told me to call this young lady and take her out to dinner. And I've been willing for 50 years to give my wife an affidavit that I attempted to call her, but I never could get through on the phone in the dormitory where she was in school at Trinity in Washington. So when I returned to Nashville and began to practice law in September 1960, I began to date my future wife, and we were married in September 1961. I was 29 years old at that point. And
what day in September? Do you know? You better know the answer to that one.
September the 9th. And this coming September the 9th, we will have been married 50 years.
What was her maiden's name? I don't think you've told us that.
Her maiden name was Geraldine Gallagher Crawford, and she was reared in her grandfather's home on Tyne Boulevard, Mr. J.M. Gallagher, a grand man. And I was very fortunate to win her hand. She thought for a long time that, and was confused because she claims, I don't have any recollection of it, that the first 3 times I ever took her out that Bill Willis was along. And she may be exaggerating by that, but she is known by her nickname of Jetty, G-E-D-Y, derived from Geraldine, I suppose.
All right, and Jetty is still putting up with you today, right?
She did. She is, and she did from the beginning. When we got married, we remodeled an old log house that was built in 1825 down in Williamson County on our family's farm. And for the first 6 years, she lived down at Clovercroft on our farm, and I left every morning and went to Fourth and Church, the Life and Casualty Tower, and she says bragged about being a farmer and left her down there to fool with the cattle if they got out of the fence and out in the road or something. She'd have to go and get some help. And our first two children were born while we were living at the farm. And
what are their names? Which two?
well, there's there's Catherine Bridget Higgins DeLay, married to William Tilden DeLay, the fourth, known as Pete, a Swanee graduate. Thomas A. Higgins Jr., who with his wife lives on our farm today. The house, that log house that he came home to as a newly born child 47 years ago. And Catherine lives here in Nashville with Pete. Thomas and his wife live down on the farm. He's a mechanical engineer. And John was born after we moved to Estes-Wood. We came back to Nashville. I think Jetty had enough of the farm, but the real reason was that it was time to put Catherine in kindergarten, and Jetty wanted Catherine to go to Overbrook, where she had been in school from the earliest days of her school experience. And so we came back, and the children, first Catherine, then Thomas, and then John, all went to Overbrook to kindergarten, and the boys went up through the 8th grade, and Catherine went on to St. Cecilia, that was on the same campus. And we've lived in the same place we moved to when we came back to Nashville. We've been there since 1967, 44 years in the same house.
And where is that, or is that a state secret?
That's on Estes-Wood.
All right. All right, back to one of the reasons you came back to Nashville. You wanted to practice law and make a living. What did you do? Who'd you practice solo or what?
Well, I was alerted in some fashion that Cornelius and Collins needed help with their circuit court practice. And so I went to see Charles Cornelius Jr. at Cornelius and Collins. And at the same time, Bill Willis, W.R. Willis Jr., they were talking to Bill Willis. And there wasn't space available at that point on the 23rd floor of the LNC Tower, so Charles Cornelius Jr. arranged for us to have office space down on the 13th floor, and we were carried on their stationery as associates, and we also had our own separate practice under the style of Willis and Higgins on the 13th floor, and that was beginning in September 1960. And I began to work, and Mr. George H. Armistead, Jr., a premier lawyer in Nashville, was of counsel to Cornelius and Collins. And I began to work principally for Mr. Armistead. or what he called cubbing. When somebody would meet us on the street, and Mr. Armistead would say, "This is young Higgins, he's cubbing for me." And Willis started working principally with Charles Cornelius Jr. and Ovid Collins, two superb lawyers. Mr. Cornelius Sr. was still practicing and relatively active at the time. Mr. Cornelius had received his undergraduate degree and master's degree at Vanderbilt, and then he went to Columbia University and finished law school about 1912 and came back to Nashville. And Mr. Armistead went to Vanderbilt undergraduate and then taught Latin and Greek for 2 years at Webb School, a boys' prep school down in Bell Buckle, to get the money to go back to law school at Vanderbilt. And Mr. Armistead was a partner at the firm of Tribune, Hume, and Armistead, which was the Tribune in that firm was the father of the Tribune that you practiced with, Charles Tribune Jr. And Mr. Tribune left and took Charles Tribune Jr. with him when he was a young man. And then Mr. Armistead left and formed a firm with William Waller that became Armistead, Waller, and Davis. And Mr. Hume, there were a number of young lawyers there at that time, and that became ultimately Hume, Howard, Davis, which was later Boat, Cummins, and Connors. Reber Boat at that point was a young lawyer up there at Tribune, Hume, and Armistead. And Lindsay Davis was a protege of George Armistead, who was later a partner in the Hume, Howard, Davis firm that became Boat, Cummins, Connors. That's sort of the historical record.
Right. Back to
but these were premier lawyers, and I was very fortunate to come under the begin my practice with Cornelius and Collins and Mr. Armistead.
And as I recall, you were primarily, not totally, but primarily involved in civil litigation when you were with that firm. Am I correct?
That's right.
And did you belong to any bar associations or that sort of thing?
Yes. Of course, I became a member of the Nashville Bar Association, the Tennessee Bar Association, the American Bar Association. And early on, at some point, I was secretary and treasurer of the Nashville Bar Association and on the board, and later on the board of directors.
And after that?
Well, at a later point, I was elected president of the Nashville Bar Association, I think in December 1971 to December 1972, an eventful year.
Eventful? In what way?
In several ways. We had a good board of directors at that time, and the first thing we did was to open up the meeting of the board of directors of the Nashville Bar Association to the press. There'd been a lot of complaints that we were meeting in secret, but yet voicing our opinion about public policy matters. And at that time, there was no board of professional discipline, and we handled our own disciplinary matters. and we opened the meetings of the Board of Directors of the Bar Association, much to the pleasure of the Nashville Tennessean and the Nashville Banner, and were given considerable credit in the editorial columns in that respect, except when we were dealing with disciplinary matters in the grievance committee. And during that year when I was president, we prosecuted 4 disbarment cases, because I prosecuted those myself with the help of my partner, Charles Hampton White. And another thing that took place that year, up to that point, the Circuit Court of Davidson County tried jury cases from 9 till 1 and adjourned for the day. The ostensible purpose was to hear non-jury cases in the afternoon, but after 1 o'clock, for the most part, the lights were off in the courtrooms over there on the 5th floor. And so the board adopted a resolution to petition the circuit judges to hold court from 9 till 4 or 4:30. The federal judges did it. Well, that wasn't all that well received by the circuit judges, but they gave in, and that began the circuit court sitting for a full day in Davidson County. And then the General Sessions judges obtained the passage of a private act in the legislature that gave them a pay raise in mid-term, which violated the Constitution of Tennessee. And so the Board of Directors authorized me to bring a lawsuit against all 9 General Sessions judges in Davidson County in the name of Thomas A. Higgins individually and as president of the Nashville Bar Association. And I can tell you that when you sue judges, and we won and made them give that money back and stop that midterm pay increase, it's not something that there's no welcome mat set out for you when you have sued these judges over there. Fortunately, most of my General Sessions days were behind me at that point, but we had an active Board of Directors of the Bar Association that year when I was president, and there was no executive secretary or staff. They've got more staff there than they do in the Pentagon now in the Nashville Bar Association. And I had the secretary at Cornelius Collins and Higgins and White to help me that year. And I followed Bill Harbison, by the way, who later, as I've said earlier, went on to the Supreme Court. He had been the president the year before. So that was my Bar Association experience.
Okay. A couple of professional organizations that I think you did mention a moment ago, perhaps you did and I didn't hear you, but you belong to the Tennessee Bar Foundation, do you not?
Yes. I don't know at what point, but I remember attending the, I guess it was a black tie dinner, and becoming a fellow of the Tennessee Bar Foundation, and paid the requisite fee, and have been a happy fellow ever since.
Another one you left out is that you were a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers.
Yes.
Now, I think you're just being modest when you didn't mention that. Tell us how you came to be a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers.
I'll add one thing. At some point, I was appointed to a special committee of the American Bar Association to obtain the adoption of the revised Code of Judicial Conduct. They had a special committee appointed to attempt to achieve the uniform adoption of the revised Code of Judicial Conduct all across the country. And so I did take an active part in the American Bar Association activities and served on that committee. And then in 1971, I was elected, 1979, I was elected a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers.
Now, how were you elected? Is that an organization that you can just pay your dues and join?
No, the American College of Trial Lawyers is an organization in the United States and the provinces of Canada that elect as fellows of the college not more than 1% of the lawyers in any state or province of Canada. And it requires a demonstration of trial practice skills, and the nomination process and investigation is confidential, and the fellows are elected by the Board of Regents of the college. And so I can say with some pride, I think it's considered a prestigious organization. It performs research through its committee system and publishes monographs on subjects that are widely regarded. And the Rules Committee of the Judicial Conference of the United States regularly invites the opinion of the American College of Trial Lawyers with regard to the revision of the federal rules of civil and criminal procedure and appellate procedure. And the advice of the American College is highly regarded by these Rules Committee of the Judicial Conference of the United States.
Right. You know, you've been talking about your work in the various bar associations, in particular the Nashville Bar Association, and that takes up a lot of time, you know.
Yes.
How much time did you spend, let's say, on just being a president of the Nashville Bar Association for that year?
Tom, after this passage of time since 1971, I wouldn't even hazard a guess, but it involved a lot of time, and the firm and my partners subsidized my effort in that respect. Of course, Mr. Cornelius and Charles Cornelius Jr. had been presidents of the Nashville Bar, as had Mr. Armistead. And Mr. Armistead had been president of the Tennessee Bar Association, and he was president at the time the Supreme Court building in Nashville was dedicated. And they were happy to make me available, and I'm grateful to them because it would have been an imposition on my partners at the time, but you know, as part of being a professional person, affords the opportunity to give back something to the legal profession, and so I have no regrets about it, and none of my partners at the time would have ever regretted it.
All right, now you've already indicated you were right heavily involved in civil litigation.
Well,
go ahead.
Bill Willis and I had our little practice as bachelor lawyers down there on the 13th floor of the L&C Tower, and those offices would have been about the size of 6 of these tables, and we were helping Cornelius and Collins up on the 23rd floor And Willis and I were glad to have anything that came our way. And we tried criminal cases by appointment. There was no public defender at the time. And any little things that came our way, divorce cases, collections, anything else. And at the same time, we were helping Cornelius and Collins and George Armistead with their circuit court practice principally. And so, you know, I had the occasion to go to court first with Mr. Armistead and sit next to him, and then with Charles Cornelius Jr., and we tried a world of cases. And then, you know, at some point, George Armistead would say, well, you select the jury, and you put the witnesses on, and that type of thing. And the same with Charles Cornelius Jr. And that's what in this day and time would be called mentoring. And I can tell you the difference. Early on, if we were not in court, I would go into Mr. Armistead's office, and I'd sit to one side, and Miss Ellen Roach, who had been his secretary since sometime in the 1920s, would bring his mail in to him. And he'd open each envelope and read it, and then if he needed it, he'd tell Miss Ellen, get Jones versus Smith, and she'd go to the file room to get Jones versus Smith. And he would answer the mail. And then after the mail was answered, and we would go to the library and begin any research we needed to do. And if a more detailed letter was being written, or an opinion letter, or pleadings being drafted, if we were drafting a plea and abatement, which nobody knows anything about now, or a demur, and drafting a little memorandum in support of it, if as he dictated it to Miss Ellen, if he momentarily faltered for a word, my job was to speak up and volunteer a word. Now, in this day and time of hourly charges by lawyers and rooms full of young lawyers, there isn't any, they wouldn't have anything like that experience of sitting in the office with a much older lawyer while he answered the mail or drafted pleadings and be called upon to suggest a word or a phrase or something. But that's how I began the practice. And we had a busy circuit court practice. And in those days, that we had terms of court that had been abolished. In Davison County, the October term began on the first Monday in October. And then you had the January term of court that ran till end of April, and we had the May term of court that went over until all the courts rose in midsummer. And so in advance of the beginning of the term of court, there'd be the call of the docket. And all the lawyers would assemble over there in Judge Bird Douglas's courtroom. He was the presiding judge in the Second Circuit Court. And they would call the docket. Wayne Pullen, the deputy circuit court clerk. For instance, they'd call the case of Bransford versus Dudley, Charles Trabue Jr. to John Hooker Sr. And if there was no answer, on more than one occasion in similar circumstances, Claude Callicott, who was a great lawyer, would rise ceremoniously and bow to the court. These would be prominent names: Bransford versus Dudley, Trabue to John Hooker, calling the lawyers' names last. Mr. Callicott would rise and bow to the court. Judge Douglas say, "Yes, Mr. Callicott." And Mr. Callicott would say, if Your Honor please, may I inquire, will that be a black tie affair? So the call of the docket was almost a social occasion. The jury box would be filled with lawyers, the courtroom would be filled with lawyers, and it was important to be there to get your case set on the docket. And so when the term of court started, the docket would be called every morning in Judge Douglas's court. And at that time, there was Judge Douglas in the Second Circuit Court, Judge Roy Miles in the First Circuit Court, and Judge Henry Todd in the Third Circuit Court. And if there were no cases already in trial, the first three cases that were ready would be assigned to First, Second, Third Court. And for the rest of the week, you have to be on standby. And if one of those cases were settled, you could be moved into it. And I remember on one occasion, and this was not unusual, Charles Cornelius Jr. and I would start a jury case in the Second Circuit Court. And when that case went to the jury, we were the next ready case when a court opened, and we would go across the hall to the First Circuit Court and pick a jury. And if the jury in the Second Circuit Court came back, we would take a recess and go back to take the jury verdict in the Second Circuit Court, and then go back across the hall and try the case in the First Circuit Court. And on one occasion, because we were working at night, we had cases going like that and another set of clients, and we had, when that case in the Second Circuit Court finished, we were taken up in the Third Circuit Court. And you talk about being busy day and night, it was a busy time. Now, of course, many of these cases were the old soft tissue injuries of the slip and fall, the intersection, the rear end collision. And a lot of them were just a question of damages. If you had a case of liability and you couldn't settle it, you had to go in, put a jury in the box, do the best you can, and just take your licks. But it was busy work, and you learned a lot about putting a jury in the box and trying lawsuits.
All right, as I said earlier, I know you tried a lot of cases. Any particular case or cases that you think might be of some significance?
Well, harking back to that year I was president of the Bar Association. No, I think it was later. There was a vacancy on the Supreme Court of Tennessee when Judge Larry Creason, who had been a chancellor in Memphis, when he died, and there was a controversy between Judge Tip Taylor from Madison County, the criminal judge down there, and Mr. Turley, who was the United States Attorney in the Western District of Tennessee. And at that same time, the legislature had adopted the Little Missouri Plan, that a call for a nominating commission and the appointment by the governor, and they'd later stand for retention. And Tom Shriver was the district attorney general here in Davidson County. And I think this was 1971 because it was in the early days of the Winfield Dunn administration. And there were competing cases filed in the Chancery Court of Davidson County in the nature of quo warranto cases. But he, as district attorney, had not joined in either of those cases. One suit was brought by Mr. Taylor and Turley, and the other was brought by Judge Taylor. And Tom called me, and I suggested that he force the dismissal of both of those cases and bring a case as district attorney general. And so we filed a case of State of Tennessee ex rel. Higgins versus Dunn et al. And it also involved a challenge to the Little Missouri Plan as calling for this retention election. We did we argued the case in Knoxville. The Supreme Court speeded up the appeal, and Shriver and I went over there and argued it for the Supreme Court sitting in Knoxville. We did knock out a section that called for the speakers of the two houses to appoint a member of the legislature as a member of the nominating commission. And of course, the Constitution prohibited a member of the legislature from holding any other office or position of trust. But we didn't get any further than that. They upheld the Missouri plan, and Allison Humphreys either dissented or filed a concurring opinion, Judge Humphreys on the Supreme Court, about the fact that he thought the legislature was playing fast and loose with the Constitution of Tennessee and the election of judges, but that's all past tense.
All right. Judge, you
That's
think,
one that occurs.
okay, you think maybe we could take another break about now?
Yeah, fine.
With your
with me.
permission, of course.
Yes. We'll take a recess, not a break.
Recess, all right.